Hello, everyone, and welcome to Friday. We used to call them Friday Fireside Chats. We're rebranding them as Thought Sparks, and they are going to be conversations with people who have some interesting ideas, new books, great thoughts, and I am absolutely thrilled on this particular week to be welcoming Susannah Fox, the author of a terrific book called Rebel Health, to join me. Susannah is a former leader in the national health system of the federal government. She's now an independent consultant, an observer, and this book, Rebel Health, is really her manifesto for how patients, caregivers, survivors, and others can begin to take control of critical issues in the health system and advocate for their own well-being and for their own medical care. So welcome, Susannah.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm just delighted. And we've been working on getting this to happen for so long. So what an incredible coincidence to be having this conversation on the Friday after UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson was fatally shot in Manhattan. And it's just been a couple of days. Just to put this in context, for those that are watching this later, we don't yet know the gunman. We don't yet know the motive, but there just is been such an incredible public reaction. I mean, the facts are that an unprovoked attack killed a man who we assume is an innocent man. And I mean, those are the facts, and that's a human tragedy. But what I've been fascinated by, and I was thinking of you like this whole week, was the reaction of people to what I think Brian Thompson came to symbolize and what UnitedHealthcare came to symbolize, the sort of wrestling and the frustration and the anger people have with the healthcare system. And I definitely want to get to the book, but I thought since this is so topical, perhaps you have some perspectives, because it seems to me that a lot of these people who are just pouring out their frustrations are the kind of people this book was really written for.
Thank you, Rita. I first want to say that my heart goes out to Brian's family and colleagues, and it was a shocking circumstance that did unfortunately unleash a torrent of complaints about healthcare in general, and unfortunately about United Health in particular. And while my book is about a different patient-led revolution, Rebel Health is about treatment innovation and innovations at the kitchen table and bedside and medical devices. What I have seen on my book tour is a significant divide between what I would say are the professionals of healthcare, and that is payers, pharmaceutical company executives, clinicians, who, when I've talked to them about what I call the patient-led revolution and how it's happening underground, people are curious, but not very concerned. They are frankly quite comfortable that they understand the industry and know where it's heading. By contrast, every time I have done a bookstore event or an event where there's going to be patients, caregivers, survivors, general consumers of healthcare, whether it's online or offline, at every single public forum, somebody has stood up or posted a comment and said, "Your book title is Rebel Health. I came to your talk because I thought that you were going to be talking about an overthrow of the American healthcare system. That's what I want to hear about." And so, and I was talking to colleagues about, even last week, about this divide, this really, this different mood that I have found in talking to consumers. And the word that I have often used is angry, incandescent anger in a lot of people. One of the issues is that the healthcare systems, and let's be honest, there are multiple systems. We can't really talk about one healthcare system. It's so complex, and there are so many aspects to it that all someone can see they don't have access or their questions aren't being answered. And it's those people whose needs are not being met and who feel invisible. Those are the people that I have spent a lot of time with as a researcher, and those are the people that I describe in my book. I want to say, though, that everyone that I feature in the book believes in science. They might have had a theory that they got from crowdsourcing, but they confirmed it with a doctor, and they sought treatment in a more mainstream way. They're just calling for mainstream healthcare to see their pain and see their suffering.
I would agree. And I think, so I'll add on to that because, one of the things I study is social movements and social change. I mean, it wouldn't be my main thing, but, if you're thinking about strategy in business and strategic inflection points, you really have to take into account the context of the greater society around you. And one of the things we were reflecting about in class, I was just teaching a class at Columbia this past week, is the sort of sequence of events that lead to quite dramatic social changes. And the way I would frame it is there's often the emergence of dissatisfaction, right? So a deep sense that all is not well with the world. So if you think of the many revolutions over many years, back in the American Revolution, right? Taxation without representation is tyranny. And what often happens is dissatisfaction crystallizes in a highly symbolic moment. And the moment looked at on its own isn't much, but what it means to people is so much more. So when I think about the Arab Spring, the young Tunisian fruit seller who literally set himself on fire because he simply couldn't bear one more minute of living under that system. And that came to symbolize for an entire generation of young people in that region just the way that their government had betrayed them and the way that they'd been let down and precipitated this action. And one of the things that it got me to thinking about was, is this another one of those moments? Is this a storming of the Bastille moment? Is this a Boston Tea Party moment? Is this a burning your bras in the American women's movement moment, where we'll look back and we'll say, that was the moment when so many things for so many people really crystallized into something that might lead to action. So the full model is, you have to have creation of dissatisfaction, but then you have to have someone who reaches out and has a broader message to appeal to a wider audience. So you go from the angry and really disaffected to more broad people. But then you have to have, the policymakers and the engineers and the scientists who kind of then fix those broken systems. And I just wonder if we're at the brink of one of those. So not to overanalyze it, but I think we might well be at one of those moments.
Unfortunately, I think we're living in interesting times. I do think that we just in the past 5 years have seen multiple before after moments. The pandemic shutdown and all of the repercussions of that. So there's the before after of the dissatisfaction, the frustration, the death. I mean, whether that's on the side of the moral trauma and moral injury experienced by clinicians, or the dissatisfaction and frustration that parents felt when they couldn't send their kids to school. There's also a before after moment in realizing how quickly science was able to bring us a COVID vaccine. That to me is a positive before after. Look at how science was able to respond to this moment, and that's a positive thing. I do think that this situation that we're living through right now is another before after, and what is so frightening is to see how many people are posting online things that you would never want posted about your loved one's death. And it's coming from this deep well of frustration and anger because healthcare is so personal. There's just so much to say about how frustrated people are. And when somebody has come to a bookstore talk and said, I came here to hear about the overthrow of the American Revolution, like, give me a pitchfork, essentially, I have said, thank you. That's a different book. I am not an economist. What I study as an anthropologist is the way that at the grassroots, there are often amazing ideas that the grass tops are not aware of. And what I try to win the person over by saying, you're going to want to be part of my revolution too. The revolution that I'm talking about is just as important. But yes, there needs to be a different discussion at a different book talk about the economics and access of American healthcare.
Oh, absolutely. But what I love about your book, and for those of you just joining us, my guest this week is Susannah Fox, author of this terrific book called Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care. And it really is a field guide. It's incredibly practical. And what I love about it is, I have a lot of authors that I come and talk, and they talk very big topics, and it's great. And then that there's a real place for that in the world, and we need big thinkers. But very often people kind of say to me afterwards, yeah, but, like, I'm just one person. What do I do? Like, what impact can I have? And what I love about your book is you have so many stories of people who just kind of took matters into their own hands, as you said, at their own kitchen tables and at their own practices in their own doctor's offices, and really began to have a big impact. So let's start with what led you to write this book, because it's a very passionate book, and it really kind of draws on your experience as, I've got the title right now, the Chief Technical Officer of the Health and Human Services Department, as well as your work doing consulting and advisory and a lot of other exciting things. So what caused the book to become a book?
Well, for many years as a researcher, I had spent time in online communities of people living with rare and life-changing diagnoses, because I got advice from a mentor who said, if you want to see the future, hang out with people on the frontier, hang out with the pioneers. And in healthcare, that's going to be people whose child has a rare disease, for example. The rare disease community was early on health data. They were early on every technology, and they're early right now on AI, generative AI, and DNA testing, for example. So this mentor said, if you hang out with them, you'll see the future of healthcare and technology. Because of that fieldwork, I started getting invited into higher level conversations like National Institutes of Health and the White House, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and eventually having the great privilege to serve at HHS as the Chief Technology Officer, where I ran this open data and innovation lab. What was very surprising to me is, as I spent more time in boardrooms and in the C-suite of healthcare, how my friends at that level of healthcare, when I would start to tell them stories about my friends who are building new communities on the frontier of healthcare, there was a total disconnect. There were even executives who said, I just can't believe what you're saying is true. And so I would say, let me tell you a story. But what I realized is that I needed to write not only an article, which is what some people said, and I love the idea of an article, but I really wanted something substantial. I wanted to spend some time thinking about how to give people language. Both my patient, survivor, caregiver friends, I wanted to give them language to describe their value and the power that they bring to healthcare. And I wanted to tell my friends in the C-suite, you need to align your mission with these rebels, because they can actually help you achieve your goals faster.
So in the book, you talk about call them types of actors in this system. Seekers, networkers, solvers, and champions. And one of the things I think is interesting about you as a person is you've experienced all four of those. You've had the opportunity to be a person looking for solutions, to be a person who's reached out to other people and connected them to those solutions, who's been able to solve some problems yourself, and in your more senior roles as someone who could really champion people who otherwise wouldn't have gotten attention. So talk a little bit about each of those roles and how they kind of connect in creating these much bigger solutions that any one person within them could have created.
Thank you. So these are the types of people that you'll meet in the revolution. And if you're a leader, it's the type of people that you might want to align your mission with. Seekers are people who realize that their questions are not being answered. And maybe scientists and clinicians aren't even aware of the problem that you are living with. And so you go out on the hunt and you don't give up. That's the most important thing to know about seekers. Networkers are people who are naturally drawn to community. They are the people who are constantly looking for connections. They pool resources and then share them in community. They're natural marketers. They're people who you want to get on your side if you have a new product idea. They can also be an early warning system. They keep track of what's going on in a community and can provide that early warning system. As we saw, for example, in COVID, the patients living with long COVID, it was patients themselves who identified this emerging issue of long COVID. Solvers are, they might be my favorite people because they really typify that rebel spirit, where if they don't have access to the data that they need or materials that they need, they'll frankly break in and take it. They will, they'll recognize a problem that needs to be solved and they'll attack it. Whether it's a system like a clinical trial that's not really well designed for patients, or if it's an assistive device or a medical device, they'll take it apart and put it back together again better. The fourth group that emerged, actually, as I was writing the book, I didn't have them in mind when I began, but in my interviews with seekers, networkers, and solvers, each one of them who was successful, who had taken an idea and was able to scale it, they named people who unlocked resources for them that are held by mainstream institutions. So, for example, a champion could be a journalist who shines a spotlight on a patient-led group, or it could be someone who can give that group regulatory guidance in the case of medical and assistive devices. Of course, funding is always needed. Champions can be investors and funders. So champions recognize patient-led groups, caregiver-led groups that have the kernel of a great idea and need some booster rockets. They need to help scale it up.
Yeah, I love that. So I think one of the most compelling stories in the book, and it's kind of appears in multiple places in the book, is the whole ecosystem around caring for people with diabetes, especially type 1 diabetes, which is, just a horrible disease. And if you don't manage it well, you can die. I mean, this is not trivial. But what's fascinating to me is throughout the book, you've got this fascinating tension between the companies that in theory are helping patients manage this disease, and they've indeed created miraculous devices and miraculous cures and miraculous treatments, but at the same time their motivations are in many cases not aligned with what would make life easier or better or more manageable for their patients. So maybe walk us through a couple of those stories. I'm thinking of the woman who couldn't hear
Oh yeah.
arm.
Yeah. Dana Lewis is an amazing woman who lives with type 1 diabetes. And at the time of this story, she was living alone. And she uses a continuous glucose monitor, which is a wearable sensor that can track someone's blood sugar at all times. So literally continuously sort of checking in on you to make sure that your blood sugar is in range. And if you start to trend low or you start to trend high, your CGM will set off an alarm. But Dana is a very deep sleeper. And if she was going low in the middle of the night, which is extremely dangerous, you could go low in the night and not wake up if your blood sugar hits a low. And this is a constant fear of anyone with insulin requiring type 1 diabetes. And since she's a deep sleeper, her CGM alarm was not loud enough to wake her up. And so she wrote to the company to say, you need to make this alarm louder. Well, at the time, this medical device company did not have what I think of as an intake valve for patients and caregivers to give them ideas about how to improve a product. And also, historically, medical device companies have not actually seen patients and caregivers as their primary client. Their customer is the prescribing clinician. And so they designed these devices, for example, to keep the data locked up inside the device. Even though here we have one of their customers calling and saying, there's a safety issue here, your alarm isn't loud enough, they chose to not do anything about that. Well, Dana is a networker. She was on Twitter at the time and was using it to connect all over the world with other people with insulin-requiring diabetes, including a dad of a 4-year-old with type 1 diabetes, John Costik. And John's an engineer, classic solver. And he was really frustrated that he and his wife had to set alarms all throughout the night to stumble down the hallway and check the screen of their son's CGM. Because again, the medical device companies had created these devices to have the data locked in. And John thought to himself, if I could free that data and send it to my Apple Watch, I could set an alarm in the night to check on my son's blood glucose, but I could at least just roll over and look at my watch and then hopefully get back to sleep if he's in range. So he did it. He was able to essentially jailbreak this medical device, send the data to his Apple Watch. And thanks to also being a networker, he essentially shared the recipe. He shared the how-to guide. And what that triggered is a cascade of innovation. For example, Dana took that opportunity to build a louder alarm for herself. Mm-hmm. Other people created other innovations. A group of parents created something called Nightscout so that they could all monitor their kid, not only at night, but also, for example, when they have a sleepover or they go on a school field trip. This idea that you should be able to have access to your body's data or your child's data. This was radical. And guess what? 10 years later, it's standard of practice. And it was a market opportunity that was exposed by patients and caregivers who were raising their hands and saying, we've got a big problem here. You're not listening to us. And their hashtag is, we are not waiting. We are not waiting for industry. We are not waiting for the government. We're going to build what we need. And I started calling them the Diabetes Rebel Alliance, and that's actually where I got the book title from the diabetes, because they really are like a rebel alliance fighting for what they need, because the enemy is disease. The enemy is not the government or a health insurance company or anything else that we might think of as a problem in the American healthcare system. The real enemy is disease.
I love that. I love that. And you have so many stories like that through the book. But let's come back to this, who the medical providers think of as their constituency, because I think that's one of the most fascinating things about healthcare. It's the only market I can think of where how you pay determines the price. Like, that's just bizarre, right? I mean, in any other product or service market, like if you want to buy our pen, right? If I'm selling it to you or if I'm selling it to you, it's right. One price. But in healthcare, it's the weirdest concatenation of things. And, to think that things like Mark Cuban's site, where he's got, the price of a pill if you're covered by insurance, or here's the price we're going to get. No, it's Amazon that does, if you're covered by insurance, it's this. If you're not covered, it's that. If you're not, but trying to even make that stuff transparent some people think that's really, really radical. And I wonder often how we've gotten ourselves to where we are, particularly with things like insulin and drugs that are really insulin was invented over 100 years ago, and the person who discovered it said insulin belongs to the people. And yet we continue to have people who are suffering because they can't afford their doses. They're not adhering to their prescriptions, and it just seems to me to be just a glaring set of mismatches. But I think part of the problem is that we have a system where the things are designed for the gatekeepers. They're not designed for the end user or the end patient, particularly, past a certain threshold of acceptability. And it just introduces these weird distortions. So one of the frameworks in the book that I really, really like is you talk about problems that are visible, so kind of people know about them, and problems that are invisible. They haven't yet been surfaced. And then, are the patient's needs really being met, or are they not? And as you kind of walk through the book, and for those of you just joining us, the book is Rebel Health, a field guide to the patient-led revolution in medical care. And as you kind of walk through the book, that framework sort of integrates where do the seekers kind of play? What should they do next, right? Who should they reach out to next? So if you've got an invisible problem with unmet needs, you need to kind of create your tribe, right? You need to you need to find a bunch of other people. And one of the interesting stories that to me illustrates the dilemma of being in that space is, I believe his name was Brett Alder, who, really interesting story. And it illustrates also that sometimes solutions don't exist because people have a shame about them, or they don't understand it's a medical issue, not like a personality flaw. And maybe tell us his story.
Sure. It's a great story. So Brett Alder is someone I met at a wonderful conference called Stanford Medicine X. And what's great is that a lot of people would be embarrassed to talk about what Brett actually calls an R-rated health condition that he has. And that is, forgive me if I start to blush myself, but essentially he is allergic to his own semen. So he realized this when he went on his honeymoon with his wife. He and his wife are members of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And one of the teachings of the church is that you should have absolutely no sexual relations before marriage. And so on their honeymoon, Brett started having flu-like symptoms. And after a while, he and his wife did some self-tracking, and that's one of my recommendations to patients who are dealing with something mysterious, is to start to take notes. That was one of the things that Brett and his wife were able to do. They took notes on when he felt ill, and they realized that unfortunately it was after they had had sex that he started to feel ill. And so he immediately became a seeker. So he went online. He started using Dr. Google, as we know, the de facto second opinion across the world. And he actually started to find communities where other men were reporting the same problem. And so he wanted to become a networker, and he did. But what he found is that there was so much shame that a lot of men didn't want to use their real names. They didn't want to raise their hand and admit to this because, as Brett has said, it's R-rated.
But even the professionals were like that. They were like, "Oh, it must be all in your head. Is this just an emotional hang-up that you have?"
Because it was rare and people don't talk about it, even doctors would say, "I don't believe you. This has got to be psychological." And Brett didn't give up, and he found a medical journal article published in the Netherlands, which had a possible treatment. And he essentially was able to freelance a DIY allergy treatment that helped him ameliorate his symptoms. And the key here is there's so many lessons to draw from this. One is the sense of, if you are dealing with something, please know that you are not alone. There are people who would love to help you if only they knew how to find you. And Brett's story illustrates that. The Diabetes Rebel Alliance illustrates that. Go out there, ask questions, network with other people to sharpen your questions so that when you do get to have a doctor's appointment, you know what questions to ask and what tests to ask for. The other thing that I'm really excited about is think about one of the most important things in Brett's story is when he found that journal article that was published in the Netherlands. I'm so excited for artificial intelligence to help us translate medical knowledge. What if there's some treatment that is available for someone, but it is only published in German or it's only published in Chinese? How might we also level the playing field and democratize access by bringing everything down to a reading level that anybody can understand in any language? That is one of the things that I am so excited about, and you'll see the passion coming through, because my whole career has been about the democratization of data and information and tools that we need to solve our own problems, no matter what we're facing.
I love that. Well, and you talk about one of your children, was it, that developed a
Yeah.
an unusual food allergy? And I think, like most of us, were like, oh well, that other stuff, that's for like that's my research subject. That isn't really me.
Yeah, I didn't even think to join a peer group of parents of kids with food allergy. I thought that I had it all together. And little did I know the allergist that I had chosen was using outdated testing procedures. Little did I know that just 1 hour up the road in Baltimore was one of the foremost allergists in the world, Robert Wood at Johns Hopkins. Well, as soon as we found out, we were able to get into Dr. Wood's practice, and it really changed our lives. And it's only because I finally admitted that I needed to join a peer group and admitted that I needed help, a little help from my friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so in the book, one of the things you talk about is, for these people playing these different roles, like, who do you reach out to next? How can you get them engaged? How can you, like, so let's say you've cobbled together a solution, you're starting to find like-minded other people. How do you now go out and get those champions who can help you scale it? And how do you kind of recruit those folks into the network? It's a very, and for those of you just joining us, I'll say it again. I talk to a lot of authors who have great ideas, but it's very hard for one person to see how they fit into the story. And this book is totally not like that. You could do something from this book this afternoon if you were so motivated, and it's not expensive and it's not hard, and you can do it without, with tools you have conveniently lying around the house. I think that's one of the really inspiring things about it, because I do think, coming back to the frustration people have with the healthcare system, I think it's that feeling of helplessness. So, oh, my medical code didn't go through, or have you seen this new thing that the Blue Cross that's doing it, that says, oh well, we've got this standard timeline that most medical procedures should take, and we're not going to pay for anesthesia past that standard timeline.
Well,
what?
Yeah, and I should say, one of that was an egregious example of I think we're going to find out that whoever thought of that, I think they've got to admit that that's a mistake, given the public outcry. But I also want to say, and this, but since I sit on the board of a Blue Cross Blue Shield health insurance company out west, Blue Cross Blue Shield is a mark and a brand that there are many plans that use that mark and brand. And those are individual health plans that make individual decisions. So this one plan, Anthem, made this extremely poor choice. And lots of people are painting with a very broad brush all of Blue Cross Blue Shield. And it's in sort of the social media, in this frankly, this revolutionary moment that we're living through, I really hope that we can get control of the rhetoric and get control of people's understanding. Yes, when something egregious is happening, we should protest it. There should be a public outcry about things that don't make sense, like the idea that a surgeon is going to have to rush through a surgery. That just doesn't make sense. And let's be clear about the root cause of that. And let's be clear about who actually is saying that, so that it isn't the whole system at fault. It is a couple of people who made a very, very poor decision.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm reminded also of one of the things in healthcare that really is hard just to explain in simple language to ordinary people. And I'll give an example. The Inflation Reduction Act contains a number of really revolutionary things from the perspective of healthcare. One being the ability for the large national payers to actually negotiate prices on a few important drugs. I mean, I do a lot of work in pharmaceuticals, and there was a fair amount of hand-wringing about that, because it's seen now as like the gap in the dike, right? And if they can do it for those 10 drugs, well, people are going to start saying, why can't they do it for more? And why can't they do it for my drug? And it shows it can be done. And I think once that wall is starting to be breached, and now people are very, very nervous, because essentially what's happened in pharmaceutical pricing, for those that aren't familiar with this, is Congress basically gave pharma companies a most favored customer clause, which what that does is, by saying that Medicare and Medicaid couldn't negotiate prices, because what that essentially does is anybody else, so any large insurer, any large payer or whatever, who comes to a pharma company and says, hey, we really want to negotiate for a better deal, the pharma company says, oh, no, can't do that, because if I did that for you, then I'd have to offer that same price to these huge payers who are a big part of our business, so just no dice. So it kind of gave them a get out of jail free card for a long time. And so that was one big provision. But the one that I think is going to have even more far-ranging implications, which has not gotten much attention at all, is the different patent cliffs for different kinds of medicine. So the what do they call the small molecule medicines, which are typically oral and less complex, and usually much more able for people without a lot of means to access, have a shorter life, patent life, than the more complex injectable large molecule the systems, which are often, you often have to infuse them or inject them or whatever. They're much more difficult, but they have a longer life. So you've got this weird situation where the government, I have to think inadvertently, is creating incentives for more accessible, cheaper, easier to take medicines to be less financed than by pharmaceutical R&D than complex, rare kind of medicine. So, and that's really hard to communicate on a morning talk show, right?
Yeah, this stuff, science and technology, these are often very complex. If you start to pull a strand and you feel like you have an understanding of one strand of the industry, or even one strand of the debate that you just described, the more you dig into it, the more you realize you don't understand. And so how can we expect people to have an understanding that they can contribute to this debate? And what you hope, and what I hope, is that the government and large corporations are allowed to create small experiments. We see that, for example, at CMS in the creation of an innovation center, the CMMI, that was a way for CMS to say, we're creating this innovation center so that we can create a place where we can innovate with payment models. And that's like what I did at HHS in running an innovation lab, where we were the office that ran all the prize competitions across all the operating divisions. We also ran an incubator, and we had a venture fund called Secretary's Venture Fund, where if there was an out-of-the-box idea that someone at the CDC or FDA or NIH or Indian Health Services, if somebody had an idea that they wanted to try, they could come to the office of the Chief Technology Officer and get the tools that they needed to try that idea in a small experiment. So I definitely don't have the expertise to comment on the small versus large molecule, but I will say I'm in favor of creating space for innovation and creating space for people who might be outside of the government or outside the industry, to have suggestions about where people's needs are not being met, and to throw a spotlight on this, frankly, very large group of people who feel that their questions aren't being answered. They feel invisible to mainstream healthcare. How can we help them see that there is a possibility for change? There is a possibility for positive movement forward, even in the huge pharmaceutical industry or the payment models. This is what I really hope this revolutionary moment can give to us, this sense of optimism and the sense of hope instead of a sense of despair, and a sense that the only thing to do is to grab a gun, which is clearly not the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to contribute to the solutions and the political change, if necessary, to create the system change that really needs to happen.
So if people feel frustrated, if they feel that they're not being heard, are there sort of first steps you might recommend? I mean, you've talked about become a seeker, don't give up, but are there kind of do your homework, get some information, find like-minded souls?
Yeah, and in the book, I talk about how not everyone is suited to be a networker, for example. But think about people in your friend group or in your family, that if you are too exhausted to think about going and finding a Facebook group or a social media hashtag that you can follow, ask someone in your life to do that for you, because it's in community that people can share ideas and pool resources. And as I like to say, borrow courage from each other, and borrow expertise, because it's in knowing that you are not alone, knowing that other people have traveled this path and maybe can show you a map of the maze that you're about to head into, or give you some vocabulary so that when you ask a question of a clinician, that clinician can actually write something in a note or hear you for the first time. That's the best thing to do. That when you are feeling alone and in despair, as I said before, you are not alone. There are people who would love to help you if only they knew how to find you.
I love that. That's such an inspiring phrase. So you sort of toward the end of the book, you talk about your own personal experiences with caregiving and what it taught you, and in particular, looking after, I guess, older.
Me through, yes.
Through. And you talked about two things that I think would be useful for people to understand, especially if they're dealing with people who are on the older side of things, or people who are very frail. And you talk about a care map and a tool called Engage with Grace. And those seem to be two specific things that you felt made a big difference.
Yes, they sure did. So I am proud to say that it's a family tradition to be a caregiver. My parents stepped up and cared for their parents when they became older, and it was my honor to care for my dad for the last year of his life. I always sat second chair to my amazing mom, Barbara Fox, who I know that you know, and then it was my turn to sit first chair when I became the caregiver to a loved one who grew up in Japan. He had married my grandmother's first cousin, but he was really like a grandpa to me. His name was Mitsuru Yasuhara. When he had gotten older and realized that because he and Anne did not have children of their own, and Anne passed away, he realized that he was alone. And he asked me to step up into that honorary daughter role. And I did so with honor and love. And I knew that this was a level jump, in our relationship. We needed to go from being fond of each other to really having a deep understanding of each other. And so the first thing that I did, actually, in our very first meeting where I accepted the role, the first thing I said was, I agree to this only if you allow me to help you, because he was really independent. and he said, okay.
That is super interesting.
Yes. And the second thing that I did was I immediately talked about death. Because he was happy and healthy and he was in his 80s. But I said, let's have a very frank conversation about your vision of the end of life. Because then if I know what you want, I can fight for you to get that. And so we had this conversation using the tool Engage with Grace, which is 5 very simple questions about what someone might want at the end of life, about things like, do you want to die at home, or would you rather die at a hospital or medical facility? What level of interventions do you want? And on down the list. And it sparked this amazing conversation between Mitsuru and I that we had never had before. And it came in handy when just a few years later, he was diagnosed with cancer. As I like to say, he went over the cancer waterfall, and I dove in after him. Gosh, I'm going to get emotional just thinking about it. The other tool that really helped both Mitsuru and I is this awesome thing called a care map. And there's an organization called Atlas of Caregiving. And the care map is something that you can actually take out a piece of paper and just draw. And if you do just a sketch of a house and put the loved one in the house, or maybe it's a couple that lives together. And if they have any pets, by the way, do a quick sketch of their dog or cat, because they're important too. And then all around the house, write the names of all the people who support them in any way, support them emotionally, or support them physically. So you write down, what was very helpful is to have all of Mitsuru's neighbors. So literally the neighbors who surround the house, make sure you have their names and their contact information. Then go to clinicians, who are all the clinicians that support the health of that family. And again, remember to include the dog and the cat and the hamster and the snake. If there's a veterinarian that you need to know about, that's important. So Mitsuru's relatives back in Japan, they were on the care map. They couldn't physically help, but they were wonderful emotional supports. When he wanted to talk with them, I had their contact information. So you draw this map, and sometimes I've drawn it with a loved one, and it shows the strength of their network. It shows that, and it makes them feel really supported, and they realize they're going into this next phase of life with a strong network. Other times I've used it as a way to illustrate to someone that there's holes in that network. That, gosh, they probably do need to do a little bit more work to make sure that their close community, that they know their neighbors, for example, because neighbors are our first responders. If something goes wrong, it's often a neighbor who's going to help you. And that was certainly true in the case with Mitsuru. So those are the 2 tools, Engage with Grace and the care map, that I recommend.
So when you became his caregiver, was that your full-time job?
Oh, no. So not at all.
Okay.
What was, he was living independently. Mitsuru was somebody who would, he lived in Princeton where I grew up, and he would bicycle to the Quaker Meeting House. He would take the bus into the city and go to the opera. So Mitsuru was totally independent. It was just that we put all the structures in place and got all the paperwork done, so that I became, his healthcare proxy. He gave me power of attorney, so that when things go sideways, you've done all your homework. You've put those structures into place. And all the neighbors knew me and knew that if anything went sideways, they should call me. And because inevitably something goes wrong, anybody listening to this conversation knows that you hope for the best, but there's going to be something eventually in life. And when that did happen, we were ready.
Mhm. I really like that, and a lot of people now are facing choices about how can they best support people. All kinds of stories about families are all spread out all over. So you might have parents who are getting older, and you live 2,000 miles away from them. How do you create some of these structures? And I really like the idea of, again, and it's not expensive. It takes a
No.
little bit of time, but not a lot of time. But just putting some of those fundamentals in place that if and when, and let's hope it's not for a long time, but if and when now they're there, and you can actually, you reach into the drawer and it's there. You don't have to kind of start in the middle of a crisis from scratch. And I think that's terrific advice.
And I'll say one more thing, and that is that when Mitsu and I finished writing all the names on the care map, I made a photocopy of it and left the original with him. And he called every single person who was listed on the care map and told them, "You're on my care map."
Ah.
And it was a way to express love, even to people who might not think of themselves as being very, very important in his life. For him to be able to express, "You are important to me." I thought it was a wonderful byproduct, that it was making visible this network of love and friendship.
And it comes back to something you said earlier, which is, if you do that, you're much less likely to feel isolated and alone, and like you're the only person on the planet who's ever faced this issue. So I think that's really practical, great advice. So the book came out a little while ago. Has anything since it came out surprised you? I mean, you've talked about the chasm really between healthcare professionals and sort of many of the communities that they serve. I think that's interesting, and I think the hand me a pitchfork moment, I think we got to be careful about that, because revolutions always lead to unintended consequences, and they may not be at all what the people who were standing at the barricades, or marching down the barricades going "Vive la France," that, eventually, and I'll take the case of the French Revolution, eventually the revolution came for the revolutionaries. And it took a long, long time and a massive dictatorship and global war to get all that sorted out eventually. So I do kind of think, what's the right word? I think we need to acknowledge the frustration and have empathy for the sources of that. But I think it would also be more constructive to try to chart a constructive path forward.
Well, that's my hope, is that people will read the book or understand what the revolution could mean for them, and that it gives them the language to say, "I'm going to take positive action. I am a seeker. I am a solver. Here's how I'm going to contribute to the positive action that could help not only myself, but anybody else who lives with my condition." Another surprise that happened to me is I was giving a talk at a corporation that I can't name. And in one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever been in. It was a wonderful occasion to really speak to some people in a hall of power in healthcare. And after my talk, where I talked about the Rebel Alliance of Healthcare, and sometimes when I talk about the rebels, I say there's the rebels and then there's the suits. And the suits are people who work for the medical device companies, pharmaceutical companies, or maybe work in the government, who literally wear suits. And my host, who I must say was wearing a suit, he got up and said, "Susannah, thank you so much for your talk. As I was sitting there, I was getting so fired up on behalf of the rebels. I want to be a rebel." And I said, "Welcome to the revolution. That's fantastic." And that's the spirit that I really want people to read the book and understand, that anyone is welcome in this revolution, that everyone has something to learn and everyone has something to teach. And if we can tap into the positive nature of what most people feel is that if you give us a chance, we're going to solve our own problem. Because remember, most of healthcare happens outside the clinic, right? And most of us want to avoid medicine. Most of us want to avoid going into the hospital and having to see a doctor. So why not empower us with information? Why not empower us with data? Why not give us the opportunity to contribute to the solutions that are actually going to really solve this healthcare crisis? Again, I can't solve the economic crisis, but I have lots of ideas about how to solve this health and well-being crisis.
And is that what you're mainly doing now? You as a consultant, as somebody who people hire, presumably to get a better perspective on these issues?
Yes, and what I love to do is make sure that I have a balanced portfolio of well-established companies that are curious and want to learn about this frontier that I talk about. And I also love working with startup companies that are tapping into the revolution of peer-to-peer healthcare.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I think to come back to AI for a minute, as that's another one of the topics of the moment, one of the things I think that is really interesting is how many of these AI applications are going to just obliterate a lot of healthcare practices. I'll give you an example. There's an Israeli company called Bina AI that I've been following. And what Bina has figured out is that right now, the current state of the art, if you need to give your vital signs, say, to get life insurance quoted, to figure out how much people will pay. And right now the prescription is you go get your blood drawn, then that result goes to a lab, and then the lab produces an analysis, and then somebody reads it, and then eventually it gets to the person who's going to price your life insurance, right? Well, what Bina does is using your phone, you do a scan of your face, and it's figured out how to make the flashlight on the phone strong enough that it can get just under the surface of your skin. And then using AI, it interprets what it finds. And in like 5 seconds after you've done your scan, it says, okay, here's your vital signs. That instantly goes to the insurance company, where an AI figures out what that pattern means. The two AIs hang out together, and then the one says, okay, this is the price. And then the front-facing AI says to the patient, okay, this is the price, click yes to accept or no. Now, here's what I think is fascinating about that. I think the example is fascinating, first of all, but the blood guy, the lab guy, the analysis guy, and the person who does the readings are completely unaware this is actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
So their
Right.
business is going to vanish. And yet, like, it's not because it's a competitor, it's an alternative that's not even in quote, quote, the healthcare space. This is a tech company that's able to do this. So I think we're going to see more and more of those kinds of examples. Oh my goodness, time is flying. What a pleasure to talk to you. So where do people learn more? How do they tap into and you're kind of an optimist, I think, about the future. How do people tap into that sort of very positive energy that you've got?
Oh, thank you. My dad was diagnosed by his therapist as irrationally optimistic. And I think in the future, we're going to find out that it's genetic. So I have a website, SusannahFox.com. I'm also very findable on all social media platforms as Susannah R. Fox. My middle initial is R. And I'd love to hear from people. If you have ideas, I would love to hear from people. I have office hours that, when available, I would love to hear from patients, caregivers, startup founders, executives, anybody who wants to hear more about the revolution.
I think that's great. So thank you so much for sharing a Friday with me here in December of 2024 on the eve of some pretty somber goings on in New York. Welcome, Susannah Fox, author of this wonderful book, Rebel Health. Do chip in, do find her. She really does love to hear from people. So I'd encourage you all to, take some matters into your own hands. Don't feel hopeless and don't feel that you're alone. I think that's a great way to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.